Hello, and welcome to 120 minutes or so on the first 120 days, Biden and the left. This is a conversation, sort of an analysis and strategic conversation brought to you from the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research. My name is Ajay Singh Chaudhary. I'm our executive director and also our core faculty member of socializing social and political theory. And joining us tonight are Kazembe Balagun, our guest from the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, where he is a project manager and a writer and a teacher and all kinds of awesome things. And also fellow BISR faculty members, Rafael Khachaturian, who also specializes in political theory, Alyssa Battistoni, who specializes in political science and political theory. We are a little political theory heavy tonight, but that seems appropriate. And Adriana Garriga-Lopez, who specializes in anthro, so a different perspective. And what this event is about really is sort of taking stock, and there's a little bit of a joke in the title, right? The 120 minutes was once a sort of radical music, hardcore music show on MTV. And as Kaz pointed out to me yesterday during we were planning this, is also sort of a Pasolini reference. So it's nice, it's high and low. But really sort of like, instead of these sort of like wishy-washy, like 100-day report cards, right, which sort of dates back to the era of FDR, if I'm not mistaken, really sort of taking stock of where things stand after the US elections from many different directions, both in terms of sort of the sort of nitty-gritty of American politics to international politics, to questions of sort of like what's happening in the social world versus what's happening amongst maybe political elites, questions of climate and race and social reproduction, and all kinds of things, and strategy, all kinds of things that can sort of come up as we sort of try to assess like what this all means. So and I should also mention that if you have questions or comments, you feel free to put those in the chat channel on Facebook. And my colleague, Elizabeth, she will transmit them to us. We're like in a little, you know how these things are. We're like in a little webinar. And also I want to thank our tech support specialist, Danielle, who is making sure this all actually works. So I think that's plenty for introduction. And I should hand it over, I think, to start off to my colleague, Alyssa, to sort of give us the first sort of opening take. We're going to do a round of sort of opening takes, then some discussion, and then open it up to your questions. So, Alyssa.
Great. Thanks, Ajay, and thanks everyone for joining us. I'm going to be mostly talking, focusing my comments pretty tightly on climate change and sort of the Biden administration climate policy and some of the these dynamics of expectation, I guess, appearance or sort of rhetoric and reality that I think are revealed in that policy specifically, or sort of policy area specifically, even though obviously kind of everything is a climate policy. I would say it's not sort of one thing, but that's maybe one of the things we can talk about more. But I do want to kind of, one of the things I've been thinking about and we'll say a bit about and we'll be interested in talking about is sort of this configuration of some of the framing that we discussed around is Biden better than we expected? What does that say about expectations, about what assessments we're setting, what kinds of goals, or like how we're measuring, right? Like what the Biden administration is doing against either expectations or some other set of parameters, and then what that means for the challenges of interacting with the Biden administration from the left. So it seems like a lot of the rhetoric around the Biden administration being better than expected has been pretty much in the area of domestic policy, not to draw too tight a line between that and sort of foreign policy or IR type stuff. Ajay will say more on that, but certainly a lot of the transformative rhetoric has been in response to the big domestic spending program. So first, the big stimulus bill that passed right in the early days of the administration, and then his large, by American standards, proposed infrastructure bills. He does seem to have learned at least one lesson from the Obama administration: don't underdo stimulus. And Rafael's going to say more about some of the political dynamics of that, I think. So I'm not going to say too much about some of the questions like why would Biden do more than people would expect in this particular area. What kind of political configuration would lead to that? I'm not going to say a ton about that here, but I think there has been a particular the gap between, I guess, expectations and appearance, and then again to reality, I think it's been very significant in climate. So I think I will say I expected very little from Biden on climate. Going into the campaign, certainly even by the end of the campaign, I think a lot of people in the kind of climate space would say something like that, but then was surprised by how much he started talking about sort of framing a lot of his policy proposals in the language of climate stuff, given that he had basically never paid attention. He was not somebody who was like known as some kind of climate guy in any way, but then he named it as a campaign priority. He said it would be the center of this infrastructure spending. There was a lot of hype about him being like a climate president who would do all these executive actions that would roll back some of what Trump had done, or reinstate various climate regulations, or do things that you could do as an executive without Congress. And that was kind of the big push prior to the Georgia Senate campaigns, which made it seem like legislative action might be possible. A few weeks ago, he hosted this global climate summit and pledged that the US would reduce carbon emissions 50% from 2005 levels by 2030. And so all of this has gotten, I think, a lot of, there has been a lot of like, wow, look at Joe Biden, like taking action on climate, like making these big strides. And that's been especially true with this big, the American Jobs Plan, which has been touted as a major climate investment. Really, he has been selling it as like, this is like the, has sold it as a response to, on the one hand, the great challenges of our time, he says, the climate crisis and the ambitions of an autocratic China. So that's how he's packaging the kind of dual challenge of the time. But he certainly has been really trying to push the climate framing. The problem is that the plan is not actually a very serious climate program, certainly not as much as he's been saying, and as much as I think a lot of media and kind of, well, both media, and then I think also some segment of like the climate progressive world, which I'll say a bit more about later. But the kind of like, wow, look, this amazing climate stuff is, I think, does not really reflect what's in the plan. I'm going to just say a little bit about the plan itself, and then kind of get into the more like what, how to think about it. So we could say there's about $4 trillion in the two big infrastructure plans, jobs plan and family plan. About a trillion could plausibly, generously said to be climate investments. That's spread over 8 years. For comparison, Bernie's climate plan proposed to spend 16 trillion on climate as a Green New Deal investment. Pretty big gap. That is about, that amounts to about 0.5% of US GDP per year. A lot of progressive economists have said that we should spend in the ballpark of at least 1% of GDP per year to do the kinds of climate investments we would want. And that's not people who are like super far left. It's kind of more mainstream progressive economists. A recent calculation based on International Energy Agency numbers by Tim Sahay and Anusar Faruqi says that Biden's own goals would require spending more on the scale of 3.3% of GDP per annum. So on its own metrics, the things that Biden has said his administration will do and the spending he's committed to that goal there's a really big gap there. The content is not much better. Most of the money is going towards support for electric cars, so $174 billion to win the EV market. Again, this is the framing. US has to compete with China. This is the kind of, and some of the rhetoric there is like the win the future rhetoric that was in the Obama years, which sounds very silly to me, but they're going with it. Compared to 80 billion for Amtrak, again, spread over 10 years. For reference, Amtrak has a repair backlog of $45 billion. So like, that's not going to go that far. So it's maybe going to clean up existing rail. It's not going to build out new rail. Similarly, 85 billion for public transit. there, the repair backlog is 105 billion. So, you're really not building a new public transit infrastructure with that money. And even the auto spending is not really enough to encourage an EV transition on the scale that Biden is sort of promising. We similarly see in housing, they have this proposal to electrify and produce, preserve, and retrofit 1 million energy efficient housing units. As Daniel O'Donnell-Cohen points out, that's less than 1% of housing stock. So like we're talking very small kind of interventions here. Even Chuck Schumer said that the public spending commitment isn't enough. And I think that's probably because he's scared of AOC, but we can leave that aside for now. All of this suggests there's like a lot more stuff we can say about what is in the bill. And what there is actually a lot of money for kind of more generic industrial policy for just like revitalizing American manufacturing. There's some stuff for like highways and airports. You could actually imagine parts of it to be worse than no bill at all if you're amping up these kinds of fossil fuel intensive infrastructures. But even just looking at the climate stuff, I think it suggests that for all the kind of like woo big spending, like FDR imagery we're getting from the Obama administration, or sorry, from the Biden administration, it's actually more hewing more closely to the Obama climate playbook in terms of the vision is you use some amount of public money to leverage private investment rather than just going big with deficit spending to like build green social housing, expand electrified bus service everywhere, fully fund coal worker pensions, and shut down remaining coal mines and plants. There are like a lot more things that you could be doing with a lot more money. And they're not doing that. They're not taking that route, just building public goods and services instead of trying to like incentivize private investment in public goods and services or private provision of those goods and services. So there's a lot more that could and should be happening. This is not, and that has been kind of, I think, hidden under the big numbers at the top of these bills, which under the surface are a lot less good on climate than I think they've been portrayed to be. So that I think is a big concern. A lot of the, I'll say a couple more things with the bill and then the politics. So a lot of the moral cover has been, or like the kind of moral framework has been around this proposed 40% investment in disadvantaged communities. And that is I think is being portrayed as a sort of like, this is the Biden administration's commitment to environmental justice, listening to organizing around environmental racism for a long time. I think it is, it's a victory to some extent, but the fact that it's a percentage of total spending means that the total spending is important, and 40% of $1 trillion spread over 8 years is a lot less than 40% of $1 trillion a year, right? So like, even if there's this sort of commitment to frontline communities in the bill, there's that is not necessarily being matched by sort of the scale of what they're committing to doing. Again, there's not a lot of public investment targeted at things like social housing, public transit that would also, I think, more directly attack some of the overlaps of sort of equity and climate issues. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of, it's really framed as it comes with a lot of this like belligerent anti-China rhetoric that, as Ajay mentioned, or maybe we just mentioned this in chatting, I can't remember, but is really a carryover from Trump policy. And I think I'm not going to go into this, but it is significant that the domestic ambition, sort of transformative rhetoric and so on, is mobilized in response to this perceived, and there's a this conjured external threat. We have to beat China, et cetera. So what's concerning to me is that beyond the substance of the policy is that the climate left, I think, is really split under Biden. A lot of people, I think, feel like they need to support this policy. This is the best we're going to get. Like, it's so much better than Trump. It's we can't be eco-purists, as a recent Politico column put it. There have been several hundred climate and environmental justice organizations recently wrote a letter criticizing the plan. I think is good, but a lot of the kind of climate progressives who were kind of like maybe on board for a Green New Deal or for the kind of more progressive left wing of climate policy before are now just like, okay, get behind Biden, we're going for this. And on the one hand, I think climate is not that different from a lot of other issues. In this respect, I think some of the kind of like progressive left, I wouldn't say unity, but there was like maybe some, anti-Trump cohesion for a while, but now we're seeing, I think, more of the like existing tensions and policy principles and views of how politics works resurfacing. But I do think climate is very vulnerable to bad faith invocations of pragmatism and cynical deployments of urgency, and to the kind of expectations, to very low expectations, basically. So I think this question around like, what do we expect from Biden? What is he delivering is very salient, because people don't expect almost anything from climate policy. It's just like, can anything happen? Can we build like one wind turbine? I don't know. I think the stakes are very high. It is very bad, it's very catastrophic. We're very far from where we need to be, and so making any progress seems better than none. And so like I can understand the kind of the sort of why some people think they have to get behind this plan. I don't think it's actually pragmatic to do that. Pragmatism is always a judgment call, but I really think that climate pragmatism can't just be like accept anything that someone calls a climate plan. It really has to be pushing the boundaries of politics as far as it can go, and organizing to do that, and raising expectations rather than lowering them, to use Jane McAlevy's organizing principle, right? The lower the expectation, the easier it is to exceed. So when we have really, really low expectations, A, for Joe Biden, and B, for climate policy in general, that is a bad combination. That makes we expect like nothing to happen. And so it's like, okay, great. Wow, there's like something better than like the nothing I was expecting. Trump lowered expectations even further, I would say. Like, I think we're operating in a sort of dangerous space of having that kind of expectation. And I know, like, I came in with like no expectations for Biden, so I was like, oh wow, he's not like, I don't know, the kind of bipartisan, like he's not doing as much bipartisan centrist crap as I was expecting. Rafael will say more about that. So it was like, oh, maybe there's something better here. And then you're like thinking about it for a minute. It's like, actually, this is not, we need to be more critical than that. But so anyway, I'm gonna leave it here. But I really do think that and in general on the left, we're used to having very low expectations for elected officials, understandably, and I think rightfully so. But I want to sort of think through how we can both not be naive about what would happen or what could happen, but also not just be like, well, this is the best we're gonna get, because I do think that can lead to actually a lot of just like resignation and acceptance of things that are not as good as they not only should be, but could be actually, and pushing for that to be better. So I think climate politics and left climate politics folks, we need to be like very disruptive and critical of this administration. So I'll leave it there. Sorry to talk so long.
Not at all. Thank you so much, Alyssa. I guess I'm going to pick up where Alyssa left off, because climate questions actually frame so much of my thinking, but I'm going to be moving a little bit into the direction of perhaps sort of comparative politics, although it does just like keep in the back of your mind everything Alyssa just said, and keep in the back of your mind, this sort of just like the sort of that general framework. I mean, I like to start a lot of talks with just sort of like always citing the current atmospheric carbon concentration, which as of last month was the highest ever. Right, there was that funny moment in the sort of early days of lockdown, especially after Europe and the US were locking down, where people where there was a decent dip in atmospheric carbon, and there were these sort of hilarious and really not very true like memes on the internet with like dolphins swimming in like canals and all this shit. It's actually all bullshit. But the really interesting thing about that is that I actually read some wonderful research papers on this, is that actually the dips you saw there are just about as much dips as you can get without actually building down, without actually like doing real work. So part of that is in here, and you'll hear it comes back in other places as well. So, but I think the place I want to start is sort of like the sort of big picture of like how much slack there is in the system sort of empirically, right? So there's this question of like, is the Biden administration like, right? The most optimistic accounts of the Biden administration are like, this is a break from neoliberalism. Okay, I don't think so, but to me, this has to be addressed on a few different levels. One, yeah, how much slack is there in the system? So the US starts from, in comparison, certainly to Europe and frankly to many other places in the world. I also want to highlight that um, the COVID stuff, it like ties in here so well. So if you think about places like Vietnam or places like Cuba, right, we actually saw what a very different governance structure, however you want to characterize those states, can achieve with remarkably less resources than places like the EU or places like the United States, which were both basket cases. In the US, there was, I think, amongst liberals and the left, a tendency to overstate that the the COVID situation in the US was principally just Trump. Right? Good governance France did real bad as well, right? Right? Like if we're thinking about that. And really that's the pattern I think that we need to be thinking about for global sort of politics in the global north right now, is an attempt to sort of reorganize sort of well-earned and increasingly mass discontent. And I think this is something maybe Kaz is going to be talking about more as well. Like from bottom up discontent, real fucking discontent, right? People burned down police stations last summer. Like that's real discontent. And to sort of reorganize that into two different versions of nationalism. Right. So I think a lot of people just associate neoliberalism and say, okay, this is that sort of like, right, the Tony Blair, Bill Clinton, like cosmopolitan sort of centrism kind of thing, right? But you can have a neoliberalism, and of course you can have capitalism, and you can have things, to quote Mackenzie Wark, that are worse than those things, that are nationalist as well, right? And in the US, liberal nationalism has been actually far more bellicose, except for maybe if you think about the second Iraq war. Liberal nationalism, and it depends how you categorize people like Bush the first and Bush the second. But liberal nationalism has been, the LBJ is your Vietnam guy, right? Like it has been very bellicose, very open to a sort of America first kind of politics. There was a wonderful article from Adam Tooze that really sort of came out swinging in sort of saying like, look, a lot of what Biden has done, think about the sort of way in which the US has like hoarded and then fought tooth and nail for the IP, and then was like, okay, we'll like talk about fucking with the IP, but only a little, right? That is America first. So like in the war of ideas, I guess Trump won and now Biden is carrying it out. Like, I hate to be that negative. I think it's a good thing that Trump is gone, but this sort of struggle between a sort of virulent far right nationalism and a more like inclusive but pretty virulent liberal nationalism seems to be the political pattern of the global north, of liberal democracies in the global north. And to me, from the point of view of left analysis and of left strategy, that is sort of catastrophic, particularly if I'm thinking of things in the way Alyssa just framed, that these are all really climate policies, right? Not just the like, how much are you investing in renewable energy, but like, how are you dealing with the border immigration situation? How are you framing your foreign policy, and so on and so forth. And the reason I think it's so important to frame this in terms of sort of an empirical question and an ideological one is that like, the universe that liberal nationalism worked on, right? And frankly, that like what many leftists, even I'd sad to say, like think of as like the golden age of social democracy in the global north, like rested on a couple of uncomfortable like characteristics, right? One, it rested on empire. People are familiar with the labor squeeze as part of neoliberalism, and that sort of imperialism rent, to quote Samir Amin, right, has sort of been squeezed away, right? So that money's not going to people. It was based on the Great Acceleration and oil, right? And I mean that in ecological and in economic terms, right? Like, and that is slowing down, right? There is an overall, so mainstream economists call this secular stagnation, critical economists call the long economic downturn, however you want to phrase it. Productivity growth is slowing in the global north and in fact in the global south too, right? So we are dealing, like whether you like it or not, with the sort of dynamics of a post-COVID world, if you look at the specificities of the political economy under COVID, it really was a winner-take-all situation, right? So it was a zero-sum game even amongst bits of capital, right? So like 25 to 50 or so firms took all the pie, and it was a lot of pie. And so, right. So for me, the first question is like, how much, and there's rebuilding from the wars, right? All these things are unique conditions that applied in, say, 1950 in, say, France, that don't apply in 2021 in, say, the United States. And I think leftists have always stumbled over this question of nationalism, frankly, in power. And, you know, when we look at, when we switch over and think about these questions, especially in terms of the sort of competition with China. And I mentioned the border. I think well, maybe this was in prep, but I'll say it again if I didn't mention it before, the sort of vaccine apartheid situation that we saw in the US, but also right, if you really want to look at like a really good case, right, I hate to say it, but right, the vaccine apartheid in Palestine was like a perfect example, not of like some weird dystopian climate future, but of like the present, right? Like, so, like the people who are, right, there's, I forget the total population of folks, right? But it's like undesirables are abandoned and not given vaccines, and some level of desirables are given vaccines, and it's tiered even within the desirables, right? There's people who are more desirable, less. I mean, that's a climate policy. It's not unrealistic. It's totally possible. And to me, when I look at the Biden administration, I can say, yeah, it's good we got Trump out. I wanted that. I'm happy about that. But I don't think we should lie to ourselves. And I think echoing what Alyssa just said, if you look at like climate science literature, and much of which is not particularly radical, it often smuggles in an understanding of sustainability that assumes like, oh, what sustainability is for everyone, right? Is for the existing 7.9 billion people on Earth, plus maybe 1 or 2 extra billion, and like and that's where our calculations start and all that stuff. And it's very noble, right? It's very like noble. I call it, actually another thing I recently wrote, an intuitive critical theory, right? It smuggles in a normative principle into an otherwise dry scientific analysis. But that is not the kind of policies that we are seeing out of the Biden administration. Like the kinds of things you'd have to be doing is like retiring fossil fuel infrastructure like yesterday, like piece by piece, like completely different attitudes towards sovereignty in the global South, completely different attitudes, like just like such, and this is, and it does in fact fall far short, I think, of what some people think of as like full socialism or full communism, but like just such dramatically different things. So I think this is an important thing that Alyssa mentioned about like keeping our expectations right, like especially, and to me, keeping them realistic. And I mean that in terms of political realism, which I think is today is a radical realism, has to be, and in terms of climate realism. And I think the thing I'll close on is something I was thinking about earlier today, that I was talked about a lot with a lot of my students last fall when I was teaching CLR James as part of a class on the Haitian Revolution. And, you know, for people who've never read the Black Jacobins, I recommend, it's a wonderful book. But anyone who's read it, right? James clearly identifies very strongly with Toussaint Louverture, and it was originally a play, and he's the hero of the play. But in fact, there's this wonderful moment that I had forgotten, and it was really fun to rediscover with students, where Toussaint lies to himself. He says, "Oh, the French are too noble to do what they're to actually do what they say they're going to do." And he lies to the people and says, "You guys don't worry. We got through the first battle, and now it's going to be okay." And he knows it's a lie. He doesn't know the first thing's a lie, but he knows the second thing's a lie. And of course, this is his sort of great downfall. Whereas Dessalines, who is in the first part of the book, appears as kind of like not the nicest guy on earth. There's some troubling things there, but whatever. Is the one who doesn't lie, right? He is not clearly right. He says, "Look, you just came through a war. Like, a third of your comrades are dead, and like the stakes are high, and there's going to be two even worse wars after this. Like it's going to be even worse before it's better. And like that's a tough pill to swallow. But of course, it's Desailly who leads the Haitian people to at least nominal, right, independence. It's and Toussaint, right, dies in a French prison, if I'm not mistaken. So I think that lesson is really important, one to sort of imbibe. So with that, I will hand it over to Rafael.
Thanks, Ajay. So I'd like to maybe just pick up exactly where you and Alyssa left things, but try to maybe scale down a little bit and talk a little bit about, just offer some thoughts on the, I guess, primarily the domestic context in which this moment is happening and how we got to this moment, and reflect a little bit on some of the political and social forces that I see as operating in play here. So I guess the first thing to say is that we are still operating in the coronavirus conjuncture.
Yes, sorry, that's
right?
so important.
This is affecting so much of the way that a lot of these dynamics are happening. I think anytime outside of the coronavirus moment, Biden is a fairly generic centrist Democrat who is very much a person ideologically molded, I think, in the 1970s and the 1980s, and is a person who survived in politics for so long because he's been able to, I think, discern pretty effectively which way the wind is blowing at a particular time and adjust accordingly. What I think this present moment has allowed him to do is given him a little bit more leeway in order to maneuver left on some socioeconomic policies, as both of you have pointed out, essentially because he's playing with house money in the sense that he's not Trump, and he's able to pick up on that expectation of functioning government that I think so many people were hoping for the last 4 years. So we've seen that happen in terms of some expansion of fiscal policy, the American Rescue Plan, the family plan that he's advanced, the infrastructure measures that you both spoke about. We also know that at this point, the Federal Reserve has been keeping interest rates pretty low, and there's been generally less concern about inflation than we had under the first Obama term and in prior years. So I do think that there are lessons that the Democrats are taking about the failure of the first Obama administration to really rise up to the demands of what dealing with the Great Recession required. And I think that there is maybe an ideological shift among some of the policymakers that they're listening to. Is this, though, a break with neoliberalism, if we consider neoliberalism a type of capitalist regime, and really the regime that capitalism has morphed into over the last 40 years? And here I'm much more skeptical to say that this is a break, or that this is akin to something like FDR's New Deal or even LBJ's Great Society. I think in many ways it's too soon to say. But I think what we need to do is keep in mind that that Biden's responsibility and the responsibility of the executive branch in this context is still to govern the capitalist state, and to govern the capitalist state in the general political interest of the capitalist class. So there are, I think, signs of perhaps adjustments in the way that that governance is going to take place. But I do think that ultimately there are still going to be limits to spending plans that are going to be subsidized primarily by taxes or anchored in taxes. We haven't really seen a kind of, as I think you or Alyssa mentioned, there's a push to incentivize private investment rather than to fully embrace deficit spending by the government, by the federal government. So I think we haven't made that break from the governing paradigm. My second point had to do with why is it that Biden has been able to step into this role, at least symbolically or ideologically, and that has to do with the question of where's the GOP in all of this? What is the GOP doing? Where are the Republicans? Because we know that Biden, at least the assumption of many, myself included, during the Democratic primaries was that Biden represented a kind of symbolic restorationism of the democratic centrist consensus of the 1990s and the early 2000s. And even though he did campaign on that, although he did also make some overtures to progressives. But I think to understand really the space in which he's operating, we also have to think of the actual, I think, ideological transformation of the Republican Party into essentially a minoritarian white supremacist party. And this is something that I think we can trace back to, I mean, there are roots to this, obviously, going back many decades. But I think one of the more proximate inflection points was the fallout from the Great Recession, in which the way in which some of the economic challenges of the recession were resolved meant that more of the contradictions actually then shifted into the cultural and the political sphere. And so between roughly 2009 and 2015 or so, when Trump kind of came onto the stage, you do see a kind of gradual breakup of the bipartisan power bloc that was forged during the Cold War and really persisted throughout the kind of, let's say, golden moment of 1989 through 2001, but even later. Aziz Rana has written some very, I think, interesting and important things about this moment. And so what we have here is the breakup of this kind of bipartisan power bloc that was initially cemented around the national security state and the fire, insurance, and real estate sectors as kind of the two key components of it. And with Trump, you have a kind of pivot towards a new model. We can talk more about in the Q&A about which fractions of capital he, I think, consolidated in a way that allowed him to win office in 2016. But the upshot is that right now, the Trump wing, the post-Trump wing, is really in full control of the GOP to an extent that I think was unexpected. I did think that there was going to be more of a, let's say, internal civil war within the Republicans between the ostensibly more moderate fraction and the more reactionary fraction. And I do think that Mitch McConnell simply was not able to rally some of those ostensible moderates with his critique of the Capitol insurrection to gain control of the narrative of where the party was going. But what this has led to is basically a kind of, I think, two things. One is that Biden has been able to pivot further left by working more unilaterally now to push so-called progressive measures or ostensibly progressive measures. And at the same time, the GOP then has been in a kind of ideological disarray because they don't really have a compelling message on COVID for working class or middle class people, people who have struggled so much over the past year and change. And because of their lack of a compelling economic message, their only messaging right now is primarily by accelerating the war on the cultural front. So the critique of socialism, all of the kind of fights that you saw the GOP picking up in the 1990s have just been heightened too much. The critique of critical race theory, all of these things that we're familiar with. So what about the far right that is not in elected office, the extra institutional far right, especially after the Capitol insurrection? I think that they're weakened, but they're not defeated. I do think that, I think some of the more encouraging signs that I've seen is that groups like the Proud Boys and other far-right formations are having more trouble recruiting in recent months. I do think that there may be a sign, this might be a sign that they are somewhat in disarray because they lost that very effective foothold in the executive office that I think Trump provided them. But at the same time, what we're seeing is that they could also then potentially take root in other parts of the state. And here I have specifically in mind in police departments and also in the institutions of the carceral state. So there's a kind of, that potential is still there. And so the midterms are then going to be, I think, kind of a bellwether as to what happens with the GOP. I do think that they're going to increasingly double down on this white minoritarian party model that seeks to govern through the counter-majoritarian institutions that are a function of our political system, primarily through the courts, but also if they win the Senate back in the next two or 3 years we will see more of that happening. And I think it's also worth noting that that prior to the November election, there were people on Wall Street who were very comfortable going on record saying that basically their optimal situation would be Biden winning the presidency and Republicans keeping control of the Senate, because they saw that as a way of controlling ambitious spending programs. And then, of course, Democrats won the Senate in what was a pretty unexpected result, and here we are. And the last thing I want to talk a little bit about is basically where this leaves the left. Of course, I think we also have to kind of keep in mind that when we speak of the left, it's not a single coherent block. As Alyssa mentioned, one of the things that we might be seeing now is a kind of, I think, a growing split perhaps between progressives and leftists who were previously united in their anti-Trump opposition. But Biden's so-called progressive centrism, I think, has successfully appropriated some elements of the Sanders agenda on domestic social issues. I don't think that they've outmaneuvered the, let's say, post-Sanders left entirely, but I think that there have been attempts to do so. More encouragingly, I do think that we're seeing the growth of a democratic socialist electoral movement that across various cities and even in states where we might not have expected to see that, so-called traditional red states. And, but I think the basic dilemma of working within or outside the Democrats still remains for this movement, and that has not been fully resolved. Reforms are still, of course, limited by the structural relationship between state and capital, which, as I said in the beginning, is still, I think, the dominant operative logic of what is happening with the Biden administration. And I think that right now we have a number of social movements and a kind of ecology of social movements that, and a number of fronts in various social struggles. And the way that these play out will determine the next 1.5 to 3 years of this administration. And primarily what I have in mind here are movements for the universalization of education and the abolition of student debt, movements for the abolition of incarceral institutions and the police that we saw explode last summer, climate and ecology, as Alyssa and Ajay spoke about, immigration, housing justice, and a revival of organized labor. And I think the challenge for the left, various left projects that we might be working in, is to bring these movements, which are overlapping but still distinct, into a kind of new historic bloc that can prevent both neoliberal retrenchment after Biden or the far-right backlash that I think is still a possibility. So I'll just leave it at that, and I'll turn it over to Kaz.
Thanks, Rafael. Kaz.
Thank you, Rafael. I'm going to pick up where you left off, but before I get into my comments, I do want to acknowledge the fact that this is May 19th, the birthday of Malcolm X, human rights activist, Black liberation prophet, also the birthday of Yuri Kochiyama, Lorraine Hansberry, and Ho Chi Minh. My favorite Malcolm X quote that I always go by as a radical is that he said that I'm not a Democrat, I am not a Republican, I'm not even an American. I got sense enough to know it. And it's from that space that he took on a cosmopolitan internationalism, right? That allowed him to look at the world from a place not only of civil rights, but from human rights. And he was allowed him to say that we are not confined to the borders of the United States, but we are much more broad and wider in terms of our solidarity, and that we're a majority, not a minority. And I think that that's a powerful way of looking at it. What I want to say is that in thinking a lot about Biden and this issue around racial justice and Black liberation, if you will, Biden had to do a flip-flop. Like Biden's history was that of somebody who was anti-busing, pro-prison, pro-mass incarceration for years. And he made his record on that. What pushed him was this particular moment that we're in terms of social movements, particularly not just the social movements, but riots. We're 1 year past the George Floyd uprising that happened in Minnesota, and the subsequent rebellions that had happened around the country after that. And that's really set the standard in terms of really reshifting and re-gearing the kind of space and place in which Biden began to have to shift in a lot of ways, at least publicly, in terms of race. But one thing that I would say in terms of Biden's own administration is that I want to think of it as like not necessarily a massive change, but kind of like, if you live in New York City, you live in the hood, you got this old supermarket, but it'll be under new management, right? And so they got the banners out, they have the flyers, and they say like, come in, get your mangoes for $1 because we know the guy that beforehand and messed up. This is the new management now, and so this is what we got right here. This is the same restaurant, new management. But I think that with the new management, I think that, like my brother Rafael had said, this is a centrist management style, right? And so the centrality of the centristness of it is about a centrist management style with concessions to the left, right? And concessions to ideas around diversity and inclusion. And so, what I've seen culturally that's been different for me is that usually when after George Floyd happened, I was not expecting Juneteenth to be a holiday. I was not expecting, Home Depot to be like, we support Black people. I never expected to see the word Black people and Home Depot in the same sentence. But here we are right now, because I think that there's a necessity around one, to bring Black people in a lot of ways. And then the question for us as a movement is, where do we want to be in and where do we want to be out, right? And where do we want to strategize our scripts of forces in terms of really pushing this conversation further out? And this is something that Malcolm talked about a lot too. He talked about, like, there's the house Negroes who work inside, and there's the field Negroes who work on the outside. And who do we want to be? To be in a lot of ways, this moment, people are looking at an inside-outside strategy in a lot of ways. And what I would say, from what I see from Biden so far, is that there's a lot of changes. There's definitely massive changes from Trump, right? You can't say that it's the same thing. He's already gotten rid of a lot of Trump's executive orders that were much more racialized in terms of like supporting Confederate monuments, or using his bully pulpit to support white supremacy. That's a major shift. Those are major shifts. You can't ignore that. But I do want to acknowledge the fact that within those major shifts, and this is something that Rafael alluded to too, is that there's a danger of centrism in terms of blunting the more radical aspects of our imaginations. And what I'm saying, and people like, and centrism is dangerous because it has a lot to do with time. Because centrism is about slowing things down. And James Baldwin once said that, whose time are we working with? I work with my generation's time, your time, my children's time, my grandchildren's time. So do we have time to deal with that? Particularly, as Alyssa mentioned too, this climate catastrophe, Ajay also, this climate catastrophe, we don't have time, right? So the centrist thing around slowing things down is not going to be of help. One thing I want to think about too is that our values have to go deeper. If Raphael's right in that these tools are being taken from the left, our values have to go deeper. So we need to have anti-capitalist values. And I think a lot about the difference between Martin Luther King calling for a guaranteed income versus Andrew Yang. And there's a radical difference between the two, right? Dr. King was speaking from an anti-capitalist, democratic, socialist space, in which he wanted a complete revolutionization of society. Someone, Andrew Yang, is going to be talking from a more centrist space where he wants to have, the more or less the keeping of the way things are, but wanting to like pad it out a little bit more. And that itself is also a danger. Also want to talk a little bit about like what I'm seeing also in terms of the fight for the future, because the fight for the future is also a fight for the past. I'm a Black Marxist, but I'm also an Afrofuturist. So I'm really interested in these questions around history and the fight against history, fight for history, but I'm also interested in this fight for the future. and I particularly around this issue around technology. We've seen it somewhat in terms of the organization around Amazon factories around the country, right? Majority Black workers who have been precarized, are facing the twin battles between automation and overwork, right? And I think part of the left's movement, and I would say is also this kind of wanting to fight to redefine work against the neo-slavery narratives that are existing. So, so we're in this moment right now where, thousands of people aren't working right now because they're choosing not to work because of this generous welfare policy that Biden's let loose. I think the left needs to support that, saying and really kind of think about how we relate to work and life in different ways. I also want to think about this question around citizenship, and the right and what rights and citizenship looks like in this particular period right now. This issue around who gets to be in the citizenry and who doesn't get to be a citizenry is a life or death issue. And we're seeing this with the vaccine. We're seeing this, across the board around the world. The darker nations are the people who are suffering most under COVID-19, all dark-skinned people in Brazil, people in India. These are things in which we have to really consider in terms of citizenry. And the fact of the matter is that the Republican Party is going to try to use the leverage of their machinery on a local level to suppress the ability for people of color, particularly Black people, to exercise their democratic participation in society. And we're seeing this with the Voting Rights Acts and the challenges of that. And so we have to go deeper and be more radical to the roots around these particular issues. And really also challenge people like centrists like Joe Manchin, who are just proposing a very watered down Voting Rights Act as opposed to more expansive Voting Rights Act. And we know that, there's some conversation around statehood in Puerto Rico, statehood in DC. My personal feeling is that symbolically that's important, but is that enough in terms of redefining what is citizenship? The last thing I would say, before I go on too long, is that I think that we learned a lot in terms of the social movements, in terms of our own political muscle. In the streets, we've seen mutual aid, we've seen self-organization, we've seen tremendous amounts of people committed to caring for each other in the midst of a global crisis, in the midst of also protests, right? And so part of the work of the left right now is not just the fight for rights, but also the fight to be social, right? And to redefine that sociality. And what does it mean to have a new social order and a new social being, to how to be together? I was in Brooklyn the other day, and and it was just maybe I'm just being a little too utopian, but I saw young kids holding hands in the park, being very respectful, mad music being played, and there wasn't a cop in sight, right? So my imaginary about what safety looks like could be a little bit different, in this particular moment when people have had experiences on the streets, protesting and being together. So my thing about it is, I think that Biden's victory is a reflection of a rejection of Trump's white ethno-nationalist revanchist agenda by a whole of the people. But the people want more. You know what I'm saying? And and I think that that's something that we can really kind of build up, and we have to believe also that the people want more. And that, but we have to be able to build that together and decide what that more is. And I'll leave it at that. And I'll toss it over to Adriana.
Thanks, Kaz. And Adriana.
Wow. Well, thanks to all of you for all the comments you've made. It's hard following Kaz. But I want to share some thoughts from here in Michigan, where I am in Anishinaabe territory. I'm originally from San Juan, Puerto Rico, though, and so I'm going to focus a little bit, or at least start by talking about Puerto Rico, especially since Kazembe gave me the el pie forzado, as we say in Puerto Rico, the entry there into talking about Puerto Rico. And so, you know, it also connects very strongly to what Rafael mentioned with regards to debt and the question of education reform, because education has been one of the places where the austerity policies that began to be implemented actually by Obama and then continued under Trump and now are continuing into the Biden administration have resulted in a decimation of the education the education system in Puerto Rico, the public education system. And so there's a very real crisis around education, especially also after the earthquake swarm that destroyed several schools and areas in Puerto Rico. And of course, now the fact that students have been out of school, many students have been out of school because of COVID-19. So I think that that's a real question about what are the changes that can be expected. That's not clear at all. What kinds of supports are going to be in place for public education, or if there's going to be a continuation of the push to make free public education, free college, which we saw some movement towards, at least in terms of community colleges. And so as an educator, I'm concerned with that. And for my sake and the sake of many other educators, and of course, many of my students who are graduating with extreme levels of debt, the prospect of returning to full student loan payments in September on a population that is not prepared for that and was expecting some kind of legislative action on this seems like a real betrayal. That seems like a serious problem that the somebody of the Democratic Party should be paying attention to. So I wanted to echo that. But in the case of Puerto Rico, my main concern is to discuss this push for statehood, which appears to be taking place, although under some dissimulation, in the Democratic Party, under the expectation that Puerto Rico would most likely vote, if Puerto Rico were to be a state, it would most likely vote Democratic and thus secure a Senate majority for the Democratic Party, right? Because at least two additional senators would have to be added. And so that is plainly the motivation. I don't think anybody really believes the discourse around citizenship or inclusion or decolonization. Statehood is not decolonization. And I think all you have to do is ask the Hawaiians and the Alaskan, the indigenous people of Hawaii and Alaska, and ask them if full inclusion through statehood meant decolonization for them. And the answer is very clearly no. And so the process of decolonization has to occur under the motor of something other than the Democratic Party's self-interest. It has to be a process that actually addresses the social needs of Puerto Ricans, the infrastructural needs of Puerto Ricans, the healthcare needs of Puerto Ricans, all of those things which are precisely being destroyed systematically by, as I said, not only the Biden administration, but the Trump and the Obama administration before them. And so that is having, severe effects in Puerto Rico. And it also, I think, creates a situation in which only the most privileged and the most right wing of Puerto Ricans are actually involved in formal politics. And so that we actually see a dominance of a right-wing discourse among the pro-statehood people in Puerto Rico. And they were, kissing Trump's boots when Trump came to Puerto Rico to throw paper towels at Hurricane Maria survivors. So now some of these same characters are determined to go to DC and I don't know, beg for statehood, I guess. And I don't think it's going to work, but it is embarrassing that people voted in Ricardo Rosselló, who was the governor that we removed. And I include myself because I was at the protests, as Ajay knows, in the summer of 2019. And now this clown is going to be sort of going back to DC to request statehood. So it's not just the Democratic Party involved in this kind of dirty politics, but it certainly doesn't reflect I think the feeling of most Puerto Ricans as far as what is truly needed what would actually constitute a new social contract for Puerto Rico, or even a process of self-determination, or even a process of recovery from these multiple catastrophes and disasters. And none of those have been undertaken in a democratic way. And the problem in Puerto Rico is a fundamental lack of democracy. And so the Biden administration does not seem prepared to address that whatsoever. My expectation is they will continue to sit on their hands, as has every administration before them. And 4 years from now, Puerto Rico will be in the same place as they were at the beginning of the Biden administration. So I don't expect any major transformation to take place. But nonetheless, the discourse, right? You see that there's as Kaz just mentioned, there's a kind of symbolic discourse around citizenship, but it doesn't translate at all to the political economic reality of the island, or I should mention also of the U.S. Virgin Islands, and specifically the indigenous population of the U.S. Virgin Islands, the Black population of the U.S. Virgin Islands. And in Puerto Rico, we see the worst effects of these processes on Black Puerto Ricans, on poor Puerto Ricans, on immigrants who are living in Puerto Rico, the same folks who did not have access to many of the social programs that were put in place because of the COVID pandemic. So that's my obsession. Of course, this question of decolonization, and I want to say again, statehood is not decolonization, but I think the people of the United States need to decide if they support decolonization, and whether to support decolonization for our colonized people, including Western Sahara. The Biden administration has restated their support for Morocco's colonial dominance over Western Sahara, as well as Palestine. Right? Do we support decolonization of Palestine, or are we willing to continue to be on the side of a criminal who has not been able to constitute a government for the past 2 years through 4 elections? So this is who we are supporting and aiding. That is not a democratic process taking place there either, and it is a colonial process as well. So I think the United States citizenry needs to take a good look at the Biden foreign policy plan, and look at the ways in which COVID-19 has also created the opportunity for a further militarization of not only the U.S.-Mexico border, but also the Mexico-Guatemala border, and of course, moving further and incursioning deeper into Latin America, including Venezuela, Colombia, Honduras, El Salvador. And we see the consequences of that, as well as of climate, severe climate disruption and multiple hurricanes. That goes a long way to explaining the massive wave of migration that we have been witnessing over many years. But again, that's not something that can be solved with guns. You're not going to solve, you're not going to convince people to not try to save their own lives. People are going to continue to do what they can and respond also to that militarization and to that proxy control. We have seen the largest mobilizations in a long time taking place in Colombia, in Venezuela, in Ecuador. We have seen indigenous people rise up as really never before, not in a modern day context, as well as massive feminist mobilizations in Chile, in Argentina, and other places that have really transformed the legal landscape and abortion access for women and birthing people all over Latin America, and created pressure, I think, for other countries that are lacking in terms of reproductive rights, women's rights, queer rights, etc. Right? I think maybe the last thing I want to go into is, I think it's time for politics to move from representational to transformational, and I think that's what the young people want to see. The young folks who have been leading the Black Lives Matter movement, the abolition struggle, the students have been significant in every revolution and every mass movement around the world, and I don't think we can lose sight of that. The students and young people are fundamental to the left, the global left solidarity project, and we must continue to engage and dialogue and go through the difficult conversations that are part of this particular moment. And I want to say the students, also Kazembe was talking about this, the students and young folks are very inspired by these new frameworks of care and mutual aid. And so I think, if as we collectively work towards greater autonomy of oppressed peoples, as we collectively work away from representational politics around race or ethnicity or identity and work towards transformational justice, transformation of institutions and structures, I think we have to continue to listen to young folks and listen to people who have been the worst affected by these structures that it is high time to change. And so we do seem to be in a transformational moment coming out of COVID. There appears to be the opportunity for some things to change. But the Biden administration is happy. I think as several of my colleagues here have noted, the Biden administration is happy to just co-opt what they can and steamroll the rest, or just buy whatever they can buy also. Because people who are doing community work, who are in NGOs, who are in community-based organizations, are also struggling with, not only resource insufficiency, but also the effects, the sort of compounded effects of the retraction of the welfare state, right? They're often organizations are in a situation where they either get funding and have their hands tied in some way, or go without funding in order to do the kinds of community work that is really necessary. So we have to see the ways in which capital also continues to restrict our political revolutionary imaginations as we connect to the existing structures that we have. We don't have collective land ownership structures other than like a couple of different frameworks, which are very limited, right? We don't have, et cetera, like these different structures that would make it possible to push forward utopian visions of the future that I think are very necessary. I think I'm going to stop there because I have no idea how long I've been talking.
No, that's great. And thank you all so much. It actually puts me like, I have like 4 pages of notes spread out in front of me and I'm like, oh my God, what's the thing I should ask? And actually, a couple things occur to me that I think, there's actually some really big theory questions around like time and shit like that I think are really interesting. And some classic politics questions about the relationship between sort of social movements and like, more strict, like representational or whatever, like state-oriented politics. But actually the thing that occurred to me, especially over the course of the last of Rafael, Kaz, and Adriana's comments, was that maybe we should start this sort of like, right, this is analysis and strategy. And perhaps we actually kind of have to start with the right. Like what's our analysis of the right? What are they up to? Does that is this only about who does that include? Why? What are they doing? And I will add, I was really our colleague Suzanne Schneider was supposed to be on this panel, but she couldn't make it tonight. And she sent me a series of notes though, and they pick up really wonderfully from Adriana's. So while people sort of think about that, I'll just mention, right? So Adriana mentioned, right, the sort of massive, it's funny, I think in the global north, this is like a really melancholic conversation. And we did an event not too long ago with Vijay Prashad, who's like, that's not how it feels from where I sit. And because Adriana is right? And it's not just in Latin America, which is primarily where she was citing, right? Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, Chile, Argentina, but really many places across the world, you have massive social movements. You also have some pretty gnarly shit, right? We have in power, right, neo-fascist regimes in places like Brazil and India, but you have these massive movements. And what Susie had sent me was a series of talking points, not talking points, but like things that, she's a specialist in the Middle East and Middle East history and Middle East politics. And specifically, she had pointed out that the Biden administration did not reverse the Trump administration's position on the moving the embassy to Jerusalem. That essentially the politics towards the Middle East has basically just been like, yeah, let's just keep everything rolling, except maybe a little bit on Iran. And thinking about Biden versus Obama on Iran, actually, Obama was much more to the left than Biden is on Iran. basically that things look very bleak. I don't mean to like butcher Susie's points here, that things look very bleak in the Middle East region, and that the US is actually even under Biden even further to the right than even like the UN Security Council or like even general, to sort of use that sort of phrasing that Rafael was using, is even sort of general sort of capitalist bloc positions on particularly that question. And I think that can be both these things could be really helpful, both for thinking about the sort of expectations question that Alyssa asked, right? Like the grounds for internationalism, what Kaz was talking about, are sort of so great today. It almost feels like terrible, like not just terrible, it's catastrophic to squander them. But thinking about all those contexts, yeah, like maybe do people think it's smart to start with what do we think about the right? Or do you want to start with social movements? I'll throw that question to you all. Like, where do you want to start?
Maybe good to start with the depressing stuff first.
Yeah, let's get the right out of the way. I mean, it's super important though, and it ran through all of your comments like so much, and mine as well. And I think it was there, but it seemed like such a universal thread. So yeah, let's start with that. Who wants to maybe wants to elaborate on what other people were saying about the right, or their own sort of things they want to add to a picture of the right? And that doesn't just have to be, of course, like in this sort of US hilarious, like Democrats versus Republicans kind of thing, but it can be the right more broadly speaking. Oh, and I'll remind, as we sort of get ready to answer this, people are putting questions in the chat. And so I'll remind people who are watching that you can put questions and comments in the chat, and we'll address them and after we sort of do this initial couple of question discussion amongst each other. So who wants to take up the challenge of the right? Let's go backwards. Adriana, do you feel, or Kaz, did you
Sure,
want to?
I can. I'll be quick, and then yeah, I'll be quick. So just to note the ways in which that the fascism of the Trump, or the neo-fascism of the Trump administration, emboldened and inspired a whole bevy of wannabe fascists around, or actual fascists. What's the difference between a wannabe fascist and a fascist? Around the world, including like in Puerto Rico, some really weird things happen, like these upper class, private school Catholic boys came out and did this whole like parade around Old San Juan with roses, and then they went to the cathedral, and they were wearing like, it looked like Italian fascists from the 1930s, and it was crazy. It was like, where is this coming from? So just the ways in which we see this in Brazil as well, as you mentioned, Ajay, and in India, very strongly, the ways in which these charismatic kind of fascistic ideas kind of seem to spark back up in ways that were very mediatized, also, that were very much about sort of producing images, right, of a certain kind of masculinity, of a certain kind of whiteness, of a certain kind of idea of power. So that's not a very profound observation, but that's what I got.
Good. Sorry, I was muted. Thank you so much, Adriana. Kaz, it looked like you wanted to jump in as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing with the right never left. I mean, I think that the right, the pun on words, the right never left. But I think that what we're seeing I think we see right here is also just and we have to be specifically careful, is that the extra parliamentary violence of the right, and the willingness for them to experiment with violence. And we saw that on January 6th in terms of the taking of the Capitol. We've certainly seen this in the cases of Dylan Roof and the situation in Canova, Wisconsin, a few months ago. And that these forces are embedded also within law enforcement as well, and ideologically embedded doing this particular work. So while the Democrats have taken over a good part of the political terrain, there's also other parts of the terrain that the right still continues to populate itself into, and continues to build around. But I think that, I mean, part of it too is also just like, I always pivot back to the social movement because I don't want to be depressed. It's like, and there's only so much I can do in controlling that work. And I know there's great people who do work around the right. I'm not one of them. I'm saying, but I think one of the things that I always look towards is that who has a more compelling vision of the way society should be run. And that's what I'm fighting for every single day, right? How do we develop a more compelling vision? And I think that that's something where I think Alyssa had mentioned before, is that we have to be able to open our eyes and lift our eyes much more wider to what we're looking at right now. The popular thing is to talk about a much more technocratic vision that's also connected to the environment. I believe also in a vision that we have to restore and repair our relationship to the land, and have I think that reparations, as a concept, has to be introduced in terms of political understanding, both in terms of our understanding of history, our relationship to each other, and our relationship to land, because all the things that we're dealing with in terms of what drives the right has to do a lot with our own senses of alienation and confusion around our own relationships. And so that's an organizing opportunity that we have at this moment to challenge the right, but also build powerful amongst ourselves in many different ways.
Myself before I try to talk. Maybe I should just keep going. And Rafael, do you want to take it? And then Alyssa, and then I'll try to cap it off.
Sure. Yeah, I just have, I guess since Kazembe and Adriana spoke a little bit about present day context, I want to maybe take a step back and to talk a little bit more about I guess the history of some of the phenomena we're dealing with. As I think I said in my talk, the presence of the far right has been longstanding in American history. Dating back to I guess in some ways the modern form of it coming out of the post-Reconstruction period and the existence of the Jim Crow South. But really kind of, I think, one of the main focal points that we can think about in terms of the rise of the modern right that then became, that then fed into contemporary Trumpism is, I think, the moment of the 1930s as a kind of inflection point, the response to the Great Depression, because you see, on the one hand, speaking of kind of looking at it in a comparative perspective, you see the rise of fascism in interwar Europe as a response to the crisis of the Depression. Whereas I think in some ways that crisis was forestalled here in the US by the New Deal. And the New Deal existed as a kind of, you could say, socio-political formation for roughly 30 to 40 years in a way that led the right to become somewhat marginal and to go underground. And they were still there. You still had moments like the John Birch Society. You had these other kinds of political formations. But really, it's the moment after that New Deal consensus begins to break down in the 1970s is when I think you can trace to the emergence of the neoliberal era, but then also some of the rise of the far right in the forms of personalities like Goldwater, like Reagan, I think, who borrowed a lot of those populist themes, Buchanan, and eventually a figure like Trump. So I think some of the interesting things to even think about of the complementarity of the modern far right and what we understand to be American neoliberalism is, I think, really, really productive to think about, to consider them not necessarily as two different logics operating in complete opposition to one another, but actually as, I think, for example, as scholars like Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Marie Gottschalk and others have argued, thinking of the way that the rise of the carceral complex since the 1970s was facilitated by the rise of neoliberal austerity logic, and then thinking of the ways that right-wing ideology managed to latch onto those institutions in particular and then grow over the following decades.
Alyssa, do you want to take it?
Yeah, I'll try, although I feel like I probably don't have anything incredibly insightful to say, and everyone has been great. Two things that come to mind to me in thinking about the right is one, kind of the weird relationship, I guess, that I think the kind of progressive anti-Trump, like, I don't know, action has to the right, where there's simultaneously a very, you know, a lot of, I think the kind of consciousness and anxiety about the far right grew and became more mainstream through the course of the Trump presidency. And yet many, now that Trump himself is gone, you know, many of the people who were very upset about the Trump as a fascist and sort of the fascist far right in the US are, I don't want to say everyone, but certainly there's some like, okay, well, it's Biden, you know, if Biden has a similar like border policy or a similar policy regarding China or something like that, that might not be like the same configuration as the kind of, as the Trump administration certainly, but that there's like more continuity, right? Like, and maybe less I guess I'm curious how much of sort of the critique of the right that we saw really emerge and go mainstream over the course of the Trump administration, which was important, will like retain its force in critiquing the elements of like Trumpism that are persisting through Biden. So I'm worried about that because right now it seems like a lot of people, I mean, you know, I don't know, I think the kind of question of like back to normal is another kind of question that kind of circles around like what Bidenism is, and there was a lot of like kind of, I think both there was a lot of critique, I think, in the early days of the both after Biden won and in the early days of the Biden administration, that like the Biden himself, people in his administration, people who voted for him wanted things to go back to normal, as if you could like resume some kind of like that Trump was an aberration and you could just like resume some sort of more smooth, like righteous American path. And I'm not sure what what I think about like whether that is sort of the, you know, I think there are some things about Biden so far that seem like they're not totally doing that. Other things that are very clearly just kind of like, okay, we need to restore, like, you know, build back better, get back to some like good American values, whatever. So anyway, I don't know. I don't quite know where the kind of like back to normal, where we land on like back to normal, but I think that's part of it, or like how we assess the kind of the aberration or not of Trump is part of how to think about the right, and it's and the relationship of like the kind of liberal center to the right now. The other piece is like just, you know, I have felt for a long time that the right has been much more aggressive on climate policy than like progressives. You know, like the right has been really good at going, you know, they branded the Green New Deal from the start, right? They were like, Green New Deal sucks, it's gonna ruin your life, like you can't, like, you know, don't support the Green New Deal, and like went out, and now like people, all these like Democrats will not touch it. And like whatever, it's a term, who cares? I don't love the Green New Deal as a term, frankly. I do like it better than Build Back Better. Like, but in any case, like it became this like toxic thing that no one wanted to, or like anyone who wanted to not be branded like a socialist, blah blah blah, like in the kind of culture where that Rafael was describing, was willing to touch. So I don't think that even like, you know, just kind of like left liberal progressives who say they care a lot about climate change and it's a priority and all this stuff, like they don't, I don't know, there's like no similar mechanism, like we're going to like make this, we're going to define the terms and set the terms, and again, set the expectations and set much higher expectations for what is possible and what actually would be good about your life if we lived in a less like just kind of like super high resource consumption, super low quality of life world, which is what I think the United States is. So I, you know, I don't, there's more to say about kind of all of that and like the relationship of like the right to the fossil fuel industry and all of that, but I'll just leave it there for now and throw it back to you, Ajay.
Thank you, Alyssa. No, I'm so happy, not happy is the wrong word, but I'm happy that both you and Kaz raised that Build Back Better slogan, which is so reactionary. Right. And you know, Adriana had mentioned, this is almost a better setup for our next question than an answer to the first one. But Adriana had mentioned, right, that and I just actually was finished days of working on a thing about like all the things that we could be doing instead of building back better, right? Specifically thinking about a sort of like quasi-utopianism that is driven by climate stuff that isn't exactly what, frankly, we have to be honest, it isn't exactly what the left was dreaming of either. It's like a slight shift in all kinds of things. Not just a slight, just a dramatic one, but still like a really cool one. And when Kaz was mentioning Afrofuturism, I remember this wonderful line from Sun Ra where he's like, what's the line? It's like, don't you know it's already the end of the world or something like that, right? And I think people often need to like hear things like that about climate. It's like, oh, the end of the world is actually just things going on like this, and even more like COVID is climate. But before we like switch into, I think we can mush the social movements question, which I think is where this leads, and maybe the time one. I did want to say on this sort of question of the right, and make sure we have time for the questions from viewers. That it, you know, Rafael had mentioned, right, that like there's been like some of these like irregular groups, right, Proud Boys, et cetera, have sort of diminished in some ways since the end of Trump era. And Kaz mentioned the how important it is not to have the sort of endless Trump sort of bile on this being spewed 24/7. That said, you know, they have the Republican Party. I mean, the far right, like there's always a question, I think, for a lot of political analysts and theorists about like, oh, is this just mask off, or is there like a qualitative shift? But however you view it, right, the far right has the Republicans, right? So it's like, and that's the thing that I think is really interesting there. And I think that, you know, in terms of their vision, the vision that, you know, people's grievances are inchoate. I think I'm one of these people that I don't even know myself, let alone someone else's inner world, right? Like it's an opaque thing, right? And so our grievances are inchoate. And the right's vision is sort of a nationalist nativism, right? And I don't mean here indigenous like native, but like native as in like native born, right? It's patriarchy, right? Right, traditionalism and patriarchy, and in the U.S., sort of a kind of like Christian supremacy or Christian order, right? And that vision is ultra reactionary, of course, and can be very appealing to a lot of folks. Especially if it does, you know, there's ways in which, especially if it can, if the left can't offer something better. And there are ways in which I think the Biden administration, as Rafael said, sort of ended up swerving maybe a little leftward more than people expected. But on some of this stuff, and I want to speak internationally, right? Like if I look at Biden, if I look at Macron, I think is really the principal example of like the ideal liberal nationalist, liberal centrist, whatever, like of our era. A lot of the same culture war stuff is their stuff, right? The people like, I don't know how much people like read like European news and like French stuff, but like it's the center that's going nuts there about like critical race theory and all this stuff. And maybe I'll just close this and switch to the other one, because Alyssa raised that question of like going back to normal. I feel like this has been preached since like the second day of lockdown. That plus that we're all in it together. But of course, normal sucks and we're not in it together. It's like coercive. It's not like ideology by consensus. It's ideology by coercion. And you know, I'll quote my old friend Teddy Adorno, who said normality is death. And I think that's really fucking true. And particularly in the sort of climate crisis. So maybe to like flip this around and then I'll read off questions from the audience before we finish. Let's ask the more bright question, which is the sort of possibilities in social movements, in new political formations for a left bloc, for a critical power in this moment. And maybe I'll reverse the order and start with Alyssa, if you don't mind. Sorry, that sort of jumped. I didn't mean to put you on the
it's
spot.
fine.
Yeah.
No, totally. I think, yeah, I mean, I think we are in I mean, like, I think basically just there's a huge amount of potential for social movements. We're in a very, I think, an exciting and fraught moment. I think something Adriana said about the end of sort of the student loan moratoriums made me think of sort of what that put together with what Rafael was saying about the kind of like COVID conjuncture reminded me of something I've been thinking about, which is kind of like when does the COVID conjuncture end? And I don't really know, maybe never, but also like in particular, when does a kind of moment of like kind of extra state support? So like eviction moratoriums, like, income support, moratoriums on student loan payments, all of that. Like at some point that's going to come to an end because that's going back to normal, right? It's like now you have to pay your loans and like get a job and like, do all this stuff that you're supposed to do in like the shitty pre-COVID normal. So like, I think I'm interested to see what happens when I think what is already, I mean, we already saw obviously the huge uprisings around George Floyd's murder last summer and just like a huge number of people out in the streets, really militant and really large numbers of people, and two things that don't always go together. Not that everyone was militant. Obviously there was like a lot of like drama over, or not drama, about like, discussion about like, whatever, like the good protester, bad protester stuff, blah, blah, blah. But like still tons of people and very militant actions, exciting, very exciting. We're in a moment with I think a lot of possibility, and I'm like, what happens with that energy? And also like the kind of just everything that's happened over the past year to people things that people have struggled with hits like the kind of end of the sort of state propping up of like life support, basically, to the extent that has happened, and the kind of like, all right, like we're the just kind of I guess attempt to return to normal. And I think that there will be a lot of I would anticipate a lot of like turmoil when that happens, and even like not when that happens, just in general. I mean, like this has been a huge like world historical event. I don't think that we should expect like sort of smooth political waters, and I think that's great. Like I think that's very exciting. Like I was one of the things that that the uprisings last summer reminded me is just that like sometimes I was feeling very hopeless last spring. I was like, oh my god, like everything is just like so bad and I don't see what's possible. Like we're all like trapped in our homes and I feel like nothing is happening. And then this amazing thing happened, and not to just say that you can just like let spontaneity kind of like erupt and you don't have to do any organizing or anything like that, but like just things are happening. I think I feel very confident are going to happen, and it really renewed my just like hope and excitement for what I think is going to be again, tumultuous, but really like a lot of opportunity for things to change and things to move, and for a lot of different kinds of, we've all talked about different aspects of, I think, political movements, like climate stuff, the Sanders campaign, like decolonization movements, BLM, obviously, like how all of these can come together in new and different ways around like a lot of the kinds of demands that we might want to see, and that might get us some of the way towards some of the utopian and even quasi-utopian things we're imagining. So I feel like I don't know exactly what that will look like, but I feel certain that that things are going to happen. So that's what makes me hopeful.
This doesn't have to be like what makes me hopeful either. I should point it out. I think
that's true. That's true.
I
The
am a believer in revolutionary
it could just be everything sucks. There are no social
no. I think that's great, but often they can be fed on pessimism and hate and rage and exhaustion as much as they can be fed on like the good feels.
That's
no,
true, but I
that's-
do
yeah.
think that like a lot of the, what might be possible might be because people are like exhausted and rageful and, all of those things. So, but since we were framing it as the depressing,
Yeah,
the
no, you're
depressing
right.
right, and
I walked
the
right into
undepressing
that.
social movements.
All right, let's hand it. Sorry, fucking Zoom has changed my order. I guess it was Rafael, then Kaz, then Adriana.
I'll just be quick. I think when we ask ourselves if where's the left right now? Is the left weak or strong? I think we need to problematize the premises of that question a little bit, because I think both strength and weakness are kind of relative, and I think things are just more multidimensional than just kind of like that either or. I guess one thing, just to circle back to one thing I had said, is that I do think that there's a lot of encouraging things that are happening, as Alyssa said, and Adriana and Kazembe have also spoken about all of these different movements happening on the ground that have really kind of, I think, accelerated over the last few years. There are, I think, experimentations with new ways of doing politics, new forms of sociality, and all of these frontiers that that these social struggles are taking place on. And I think the coronavirus conjuncture has actually made those frontiers much more urgent than they ever were before, or it seemed much more urgent. So I think just maybe to circle back to what Kaz had said about this fascinating topic of time and work, and of the new sociality. I think this past year has, for many of us, not all of us, but for many of us, has given us a different perception of what time is, and what a life with less work might look like, or at least a life with forms of precisely because the nature of work itself has, I think, become so transparent to so many people over the past year. So I think the possibility of having the state step in to actually provide people with resources, with funds, is something that is going to be difficult for people to turn away from, or to not get habituated to that once they've had that experience. And I think that actually opens up new frontiers in terms of what it is that we think of when we think of work, that we don't need to work 8 hours a day, or we don't need to work 12 hours a day, or however long, that there are more important things to life than spending X amount of our day at work, X amount commuting back and forth from work, or doing other things. So I just think that question of posing that question of time and work, and what kind of society we would like to imagine beyond capitalism, is, I think, something that is very worth thinking about, and not forgetting as we move to whatever the new normal might be.
Kaz?
Yeah, I don't have much more than add. I think that I always go back to this idea around the revolution of values that Dr. King always talks about, and I think that this is something that connects, political engagement, personal transformation, and economic liberation. And I think that those are the three matrices that I think that we're going to be working on at this point right now, because I don't think anybody can come out of this situation of, not to mention COVID-19 crisis, but just the past 10 years of, Occupy, Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, and not be radically transformed. I'm speaking from a long-term view as somebody who's been involved in social movements since the 92 uprisings, and to see the level of transformation that's already, the crises and the opportunities that happened so far has been amazing. But the thing about time is that the time can also just narrow very quickly, right? And the thing about it is that, sometimes the traditional bastions that we've gone to in terms of, to hasten the transformation can be at times the very people, the very institutions that are slowing things down. And so, so when we talk about the right wing, we think about them as the people that I see in Charleston, South Carolina, when I visit my dad, who have the big MAGA hats and have the Trump 72, inch Trump flags from their pickup trucks. But it's also just the attitudes as well, social conservatism as well. And it's like at times when I think about the limitations that sometimes people put into saying that we can't do that, particularly when it comes from older generations at times, versus sometimes younger generations. And those are sometimes the wounds that we have to heal as well. Also, the other part around the tensions within social movements is the fact that, there's a lot of organizing and re-socialization that we have to do within our movements, particularly around issues around race, and being able to talk about race in a much more clear, concise, and open way. Because it's stated that when statistics say that when you talk about Green New Deal in regards to racial justice, support for Green New Deal amongst most white Americans go down. Right, but if you use it in terms of like race neutral language, most people like it, right? So how do we actually have those conversations? But also the very fact of the matter is that there's a very popular conception that Black people aren't for socialism, but statistically showing, if you ask Black people if they're in favor of socialism, 60% of them are like, yeah, we want free shit. We want like free healthcare. We want free education. We want, and that goes across the board for many different people. So there's a new historical center that needs to be built around these things, but we can't do it by taking shortcuts. And we have to be very open and honest about the history of this country. Saying that in order for us to be able to get to where we need to go, and that's a task of our movements at this moment right now. And I think that this is the moment we can do it now, before in the next 8 to 10 years is this sliver of time that we have, in my humble opinion.
All right, thanks, Kaz. Adriana.
Okay, once again, unenviable to be the last person commenting here, but so much has been said that I agree with, and I also think that there is an opportunity that we have right now to take advantage of the kinds of consensus building that happened over the past year and a half through the response to COVID, which also included a lot of mutual aid and a lot of ramping up of capacity and organization around communities around the notion of mutual aid, and that has extended also into international networks, mutual aid networks, and disaster response mutual aid networks, which are going to be increasingly necessary as the climate disruption leads to more and more frequent climate catastrophes. So I think that is one of the largest confrontations ahead of us in terms of the state and state power are the challenges that climate change or climate disruption as a global process will produce, and whether we will continue to function politically on the basis of nation state model and the exclusionary process of citizenship on a eugenics basis, basically, or a capital accumulation basis, or whether we will actually be able to discover a new political form, a new form of organization that does not reproduce the colonial violence that is at the heart of not just the U.S. national project, as Kazembe was just talking about, but also every other, national state project, at least in the Americas and in the Caribbean and in many other places as well. And so, we see, for example, I do, however, draw a lot of inspiration from what I have seen has been a militant migrant activism. I think that not enough attention is paid on the left to the incredible organizing and really confrontational and very effective activism that the Dreamers and other immigrant groups have taken on in the United States. And those are really important networks all over the global south as well. I also see an opportunity to unionize contingent workers or contract laborers. We see an increasing push for that. I think that's one good thing that's happening, leading to the strikes that we've seen in Amazon. But also we've seen a couple of small, admittedly small, but very inspiring strikes by farm workers during COVID time. And so I think that's another encouraging sign that is sort of reflects the fact that people are connecting the dots, and especially because of the resurgence of the discourse on types of labor, essential labor, frontline labor, health labor, right? All these terms, which are class terms, and they're also racialized terms, and that has become evident to anybody who has been paying attention, to a degree that I think it has pushed some people in the center towards perhaps a little bit more towards the left. And so, I'm looking forward to seeing how these energies continue to generate what I think is the largest challenge, which is building really a global but predominantly South-South solidarity links. I think that is a really important task that we have to continue to take on, and we have to build infrastructures of exchange, knowledge exchange, cultural exchange that bypass Europe and the United States, and that make it possible to build in other places something that is going to ultimately also transform the situation of people here in the United States as well. And then the last thing I'll say is, I think feminism, in particular Black feminism, has been incredibly enlivened and seriously taken up by scholars, but also by people on the streets in protest and in all kinds of creative practices. People have been reading, people have been doing reading groups on Zoom, and really engaging deeply with Black feminist literature and ideas and abolitionist work in a way that I think is reframing, and this is really important, the discourse on rest. And I love that. We all love that because we're all so fucking tired. So, the Nap Ministry highly recommended Instagram account. If you don't already follow them, you should. It's great to get the reminder from them whenever you scroll past their Instagram profile that you should go take a nap. So, all of these cultural transformations also matter, and the way that people are understanding care as work. I know several of you have already mentioned this, but the idea of care work. I was listening to somebody the other day talk about what would a care strike look like, which is really interesting idea, no? So, I think the pandemic has also highlighted that the work of care, not just that healthcare providers do, although I think that is very significant, and also segmented by race, class, gender, right? So I think those are some ways that we can look forward to, what's ahead of us, and again, I think that continuing to build global solidarity and trying to bypass, things like the economic sanctions that the Biden administration has placed on Syria and other, these are having real world consequences. They're leading to disastrous effects. So just because he announces the pullout of Afghanistan doesn't mean that then doesn't create the opportunity for continuing to basically create destruction around the world. So I'll stop there, but I agree with so much of what all of you have said.
Thanks, Adriana. And it's actually my task to go last and then pivot somehow to these viewer questions. So that task is tough because everything everyone said is great. And especially this last thing on rest really speaks to a lot of my own thought very much. There's a great line from Fannie Lou Hamer, right? I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired, which really, like, in the COVID era, I think, is that on your wall, man? Oh, no shit. Oh, yeah. I can't hear you. So,
oh, yeah, this is Fannie Lou right over here. I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired right over here.
Yeah, it's like a wonderful fucking line.
Yeah.
And I actually think it's like really at the core of, in fact, possibly what the left can offer. But just to sort of like draw us back for a moment, like, I think one of the things that Alyssa pointed to is so important, and like, is this, like, there was a lot of radical critique developed against the right, against the Trump administration. And, there is a sort of tearing away, but I think there is hope in people like pushing forward on that. And I think it's so crucial that Adriana highlighted like the militant migrant movements. You can name names here, it doesn't really matter, but a lot of what people sometimes say, oh, that's a distraction. No, actually that was kind of like the heart, right? Both Rafael and Kaz mentioned sort of like abolition movements, reparation, things like that. Like this is not a sort of sideshow, right? This is where the energy of the left is so important. And the only thing and I'll mention one other thing from the notes that Susie sent me, which is really interesting to this conversation, where she was like, really what's happening right now, which really can be characterized as maybe the beginnings of a third intifada in Palestine, is gaining traction in the West, partially because of left organizing, but also because, like, as with the sort of George Floyd moment, it's simply circulating, right? This is not to like go back to like the sort of Arab Spring Twitter argument, but rather just saying like people can see it. And that's not only because of circulation of things in digital media, but also because of the sort of, and it's all quite small still, right? But the burgeoning counter hegemony, hegemonic institutions, whether that be public intellectual, whether that be educational, like whatever, that are helping to spread this stuff. And I think that's so important, as unfortunately is the sort of time horizon that Kaz raised. And I think Alyssa kind of did too, but right, which is like, we can call it the present, we can call it the past, we can call it the future, but we're really talking about an 8 to 10 year window. And in some ways, to me, COVID, feels like the event horizon, probably the way that like erosion felt like the event horizon in Micronesia. It's like, I don't expect COVID, like things like this to like go away. They're like every bit of scientific research I've ever read, and every sort of intuitive piece of logic basically says, no. Like once these things start, it's just going to keep piling on. So that's not the most bright thing, but it does. We have seen in response just tremendous acceleration of social movements. Going all the way back to what Kaz was talking about, right? The 90s, and then the anti-war stuff, and then Occupy and BLM and the Sanders campaign, all this stuff, just to use US examples, let alone the fucking world. So that stuff is exciting, and really seems to be where a lot of the possibilities, and even electorally, right? These pockets of left electoral power have actually been, to me, at least to my analysis, much more meaningful than maybe what the Biden administration represents. These sort of, and again, it really is pockets, right? And many of us are speaking from those pockets, right? Queens, Philadelphia, Brooklyn, Bronx. I don't know what things are like in Michigan right now.
The Spirit Republic of Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
In Kalamazoo.
Yeah, I was gonna say, baby PR. I don't know what's going on in Michigan. But let's, before we finish up, go to some questions that people are asking here. There's at least 2 or 3 that I think are really germane. And I'll just read them and people can jump in instead of me calling on you. So question, I'll go backwards in some ways. Question the first, has President Biden's COVID-19 aid package, including extending unemployment benefits, ended the Reagan-Clinton consensus that the, quote, era of big government is over? Or once COVID fades, will Reagan-Clinton thinking return? So that's sort of like one of the big questions in a nutshell. So who wants to take a stab at it? No one wants to take a stab at it.
I guess I could answer it briefly. As I kind of said, I think that we're in a transition period, but I'm not entirely sure, and I think it's too early to say for certain that this has been kind of the stake in the heart of that neoliberal way of thinking about big government. I do think that that a lot of it just does depend on the social movements that we have on the ground, precisely because of their ability to raise the standard of what we think is acceptable for government to be able to be willing to do for us. And so long as like those demands are being articulated and are being pushed beyond what is beyond that I think would be the tendency to actually roll back government at some point, and especially once those benefits are being seen by the capitalist class as too excessive, too generous, which we are already starting to see with rents expiring, with with the rent holds expiring, with some of these other attempted rollbacks. If we are able to mobilize beyond that, then it could be plausible to see that that era of big government is over in that traditional sense. But I think it's also important to just emphasize that that Reagan-Clinton way of thinking about big government was always much more of an ideological phenomenon than it was an actual empirical reality. Simply because the opposition, the identification of neoliberalism with a weak state is not, it's I think empirically inaccurate, precisely because the state grew. It just grew during those years. It just grew in other facets rather than in the those that we traditionally identify with the welfare state as such.
Yeah. I'm happy to add to that, although I want to echo that last point very much, because it's sort of like the state's popular sovereign aspects and popular distributional aspects sort of shrink for sure, but like its coercive aspects, which in fact many of us have identified as where in fact right actors love to live, have radically expanded. And there's great work that's been written on this. The only thing I wanted to add is I was tempted to start this off by actually reeling off horrifying statistics, which is something I like to do sometimes. Because if you want to look at horrifying statistics, like look at the K-shaped recovery, like unemployment, it's like some of the unemployment is for sure this like new bottom limit, and some of it is people that's been cast out of the system. And like if you earn above 60,000 a year, like it's already like back to normal for you. But if you are in the 48 to 50% of Americans, that's in America, by the way. So when we're talking South way, Adriana just I think is correct. That includes like pockets of South in the global North, right? And I think that speaks very much to the race and the subaltern question that Kazembe was raising. Like for those Americans, like it's like 30% still increase in unemployment. And if we look up to our supposed friends over on the other side of the Atlantic, it's even dismaler, right? It's an even worse picture. And overall labor income is down, and we know it's been flat for years and negative if you take into account prices and all kinds of shit, right? Is down 3%. So like that shit is fucking horrifying, let alone getting into like all kinds of other stuff. The thing I'll say about the sort of too soon to say and the sort of aid package is one, Trump's aid package was $3.5 trillion too. So if our only measure for like neoliberalism is just like state debt spending, then like Trump ended neoliberalism. Like, you know, I don't get it. Like I don't quite buy that. And the other thing that I find very troubling, in addition to like maybe some climate stuff that is better related to other questions and better handled by Alyssa, like, is that a lot of this stuff is like things that would have been permanent. For example, the $15 minimum wage were rejected. And all the other stuff is specifically characterized as one-offs, temporary sunsetting programs, right? Like once we're back on our feet, then you can pay your loan again. Once we're back on our feet, you can pay your rent again, right? And so on and so forth. And that has not disappeared one iota under Biden. And in fact, right, the Biden package is remarkably similar to the Trump package. It is more as there's things that are admirable about it in terms of inclusivity, in terms of some of the targeted programs for education funding, for example, things like that. I actually think like the EV targeting is like actually bad, is actually a step in the wrong direction. Cars are not part of a good climate alternate utopia, y'all. Like and like it's not like good news for like anyone to be like tearing that shit out of the earth. But I don't know if anyone else wants to speak to this question, or if I should move to the next one. or Alyssa, yeah.
One, I can just add like really briefly, like I mean this sort of just elaborates on things that Rafael and Ajay have said, but I think like we're not going to see a return because that's not how. I mean, in general, like things are never, you know, we're not going to go back to like a Reagan or Clinton, because we're in a different time. And I do think that like the question of big government is sometimes like, well, what government for who, or like what part of the state and for who and what. And I do think it's plausible you could see like more state spending, not only on carceral aspects and the sort of like punitive repressive arm of the state, but in like, you know, infrastructure spending as like a way to reboost capital, right? Like that doesn't necessarily mean it's for the people, for like things that people need, and that could be, I mean, that could even be a sort of if not fully post neoliberal, a different kind of capitalism. Like the state doesn't necessarily have only the kind of like the size of government. And this, I think, just like, you know, Rafael and Ajay have suggested this, but like we should be careful not to sort of like identify that with any particular orientation towards like popular welfare. But even there, like this is like a sort of minor data point, but Janet Yellen, who's the Treasury Secretary, did this like tweet thread, I think it was just yesterday, that people like, wow, the end of neoliberalism. But she literally says, it's time to, I'm just going to read this tweet. It's the time to recommit our government to playing a more active and smarter role in the economy. The administration's planned actions are not fiscal stimulus in the way we have seen in the past, nor are they intended to target a particular size of government. So like there's a very active refutation of like big government, I think, in that line. And it's like a tweet, whatever. It's not, and again, like the size of government is not what we should be aiming for on the left. Like, I don't know, the size of government is not like my lodestar, but even within the framing of like, you know, what they're like they're trying to just be like, work smarter, you know, smart government, not big government, right? So like let's you know, like also take that into consideration and thinking about you know, I think all the things that both Rafael and Ajay had said in assessing some of the kind of like potential or like what they're even trying to do, let alone what they are doing. So
oh shit, all right, thanks. So I think I'll pose the next one, and then there's one other. So question the second, President Biden supported the labor union drive at Amazon's warehouse in Alabama. This was the Bessemer drive. Would Presidents Clinton and Obama have made a similar statement?
I mean, I think, wasn't it didn't somebody say, I think it was like the first time a president has supported a labor, you know, organize a labor struggle since FDR, possibly even, I don't know. It was like the first time a president has come out in support of a union, I think, in a very long time. So I think the answer is they didn't, and I assume they wouldn't have in this case either. Not that it did very much for Bessemer. So.
Sorry, does anyone else have thoughts on this sort of, I mean, we can sort of, I guess, abstract this a little bit into questions of union politics.
Yeah, I mean, I remember this, like, I mean, there was something similar, I think, in like Obama's time, when he first got elected, like, you know, there would be quicker union checkoffs, and that didn't go through, and then, you know, and that kind of fell through, and there was like a really tense situation in unions during Obama's time, certainly Clinton's time, and, you know, and certainly, you know, and so what we're seeing now is, you know, a response to this reblooming of the union movement that's coming through the grassroots, and that's coming through social unionism movements like Fight for 15. You know, it's like the intersections of these different movements of racial justice and economic justice that we're seeing on the ground. And so that was what the response was. And I think that, you know, part of it is a feedback to those movements, and another part of it is something of that corporate capture, of the temptation of that capture of that by the Democrat Party as Rafael said. But I think that, there's a lot of movement that has to be done. I mean, we have to pass the PRO Act. We have to do a lot of this other work too. So
Mhm.
and certainly, some of the in terms of environmentalism, some of the tensions between the union movements and environmentalism has been real. In the past few years, few months, we're seeing, from my understanding, we're seeing a little bit of a lessening of that. But the tensions still remain. And in some instances, social, we're in a position too where we have to challenge unions to the left as well.
Yeah.
Particularly around social issues. I'm thinking specifically around policing. I'm particularly thinking about, what's going on in New York City right now, where, there's a demand for more cops on the subways, and certain unions are pushing that. We have to push back on that. So
Yeah.
the answer to that is probably not, but still, I think if we think about by this time, there's going to be multiple movements about pushing each other in certain directions.
Does anyone else want to add to this question? One thing I'll say, and then I'll read the last one, is I think, Alyssa already stated the history, and I think Kaz stated the politics. The only thing I think to add is that I think there's a lot of left strategic thinking that needs to sort of be reevaluated about unions as like the principal actor or as part of a movement. A lot of people much smarter than me have written about this, but like unions are like, as institutionally, are like a defensive bulwark. They're not sort of set up to be offensive agents often, especially the ones we have in the United States. So I think that, yeah, it's true. Biden said that, and Obama maybe said some stuff, and Clinton, I doubt, said anything. So maybe that's good, but a lot more needs to happen. The last question. Yeah, Adriana, sorry, go ahead.
I have a comment that I'm going to steal from my lovely partner who I was talking to about this earlier today, because I think there is a way in which Obama's playing to the center, and Biden having been having been part of his administration, and then now confronting a kind of more intense progressive push, could push Biden more to the left, just as a way of kind of outdoing Obama, if you will. So there's a slight potential for that kind of interesting political outcome, where Biden would try to kind of claim his position as the new FDR or something by kind of maybe trying to push through some of the things that Obama fell short on. So I think as far as the question, I think you answered it, but there's that additional dynamic there of a kind of almost a personal jealousy, right? They're kind of like,
it's like a narcissism or something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What's your presidential legacy kind of thing, right? And in that sense, that kind of narcissistic energy might actually push in the direction of
sometimes you want venal politicians. Conjecture. They're better than principled ones that are against you. All right, so the last one, which kind of puts us full circle, I have to say this is perfect. Does the Biden climate plan meet the strictures of the Paris Agreement? And does the latter seem sufficient to tackle the climate challenges we face, assuming all of the signatories met their obligations? Alyssa, I'm going to assume you wish to take this one first.
Yeah, I can. I'm actually not sure what the sort of, if there's like a calculation of what exactly the sort of Biden plan against like the Paris commitment. I don't think the Paris commitment is sufficient. So in some cases, like, it's, that was always, like that was another case, I think, where like a climate action, that was like the big climate triumph of the Obama presidency, but it was really underwhelming. It was, I think, pretty widely criticized by, by climate activists as being, not both inadequate in terms of individual country commitments and as a collective commitment. So it's not sort of like the bar, going back to the question of expectations and where we're setting them and what standards we're using to evaluate policy. I would not want to use that standard to evaluate the Biden plan. But yeah, I don't have a sort of empirical analysis for you, unfortunately.
I mean, I'll add to that is simply, I mean, something I've written about before, but the Paris Agreement, like on the day it was signed, it was already self-contradictory, right? The things it said it was aiming for, and then the things it said it was going to do to even if everyone in the non-binding treaty were to do the things that they said they were going to do, didn't add up to the same things. Right. So like, and I mean this on a strictly, like I swear I'm not playing like Marx bro on this, like on a strictly just counting the numbers basis. It was self-contradictory, literally the moment it was signed. So I, like Alyssa, I don't know how much I know Biden has signed or re-entered the agreement. The agreement kind of like, I think represents everything problematic about the liberal version of climate politics, which is like, oh, we need to like do a little bit of thing. So we'll like do this thing and we'll sort of nibble around the edges, but it's not it's like, yeah, nibbling around the edges. It's like, that doesn't actually apply. Like there isn't, as Kaz says, it's like kind of 8 to 10 years to deal with some of this shit. Like, and like both like centrists, but even some leftist horizons were always like, oh, we can wait around. We can let capital do X, Y, and Z, and eventually we're going to take it up. It's like, nah, now this shit's different. It's like, and I think the Paris Agreement is like a really good example of that, or a really good symbol for that. Because I think some people are like, oh yeah, good, we signed this. It's great. We're back on team good. But the Paris Agreement is not a plan that's like not for climate apartheid. It's not for sustainability for 8 billion people. It is a plan for like kind of like it is a mitigation and adaptation scenario, but it's one aiming probably in reality for like a 3.5 to 4 degree change world and all the other things that come with that, which is a gnarly outcome for the majority of humans, again, South and North, but it's a great outcome for Jeff Bezos and some of his buds, so I don't know if anyone wants to add anything there.
I mean, I'll just say that insofar, I mean, the adding up to less than what it's promised is also true of the Biden plan, where he's like, we're going to hit this goal. And then it's like, okay, well, that's not what the things that you're putting forward so far are getting you to. So like the critique, then the eco purists are criticized for pointing out that they don't match. And that is, I think, actually a
right, just on like straight accounting
of climate stuff. Yeah, you're like, you literally said you want to get here, and the stuff you said gets you here. So like, what's happening? But this happens over and over again, and it is unfortunate, but something to keep an eye out for when you hear big climate promises. Sorry, Adriana, you should go ahead.
No, I know. I'm so glad you said that. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the indigenous response to the Green New Deal, because that has been the strongest, I think, the internal critique within the United States. I think these contradictions exist worldwide, and so it's not just the United States that's confronting those kinds of double, that is somehow thinking they can buy time by doing this double speak, no? But it is the case. Sorry, I lost my train of thought completely. I'm so tired.
It's okay. You were talking about like
the indigenous response. Yes. Yeah. So the Red New Deal, right? There's been the publication of the so-called Red New Deal, which is an indigenous-led version of the Green New Deal with with a different emphasis in some of precisely around some of the things that that both Ajay and Alyssa were just talking about. And so I think, when we look at the who is on the forefront of environmental struggles, who is being killed for protecting territory, land, water, whose lives are actually directly in the sightlines with regards to these kinds of machinations and negotiations that seem all to be about numbers. And and abstract concepts, and whether it's 2 degrees or 4 degrees, what that actually translates to is the death of thousands of indigenous people
Yes.
who are at the forefront of these confrontations with multinational corporations in Brazil, in India, I mean, everywhere. No?
Yeah.
And so, how do we reframe a way? Again, I think this is the fundamental task. How do we reframe the response to the environmental crisis away from a question of national economy,
Which is
without
already
neglecting
kind of fictitious anyway in the modern
already,
world.
but
Yeah.
also without neglecting the real ways in which it could actually transform some of the economic relations and potentially redistribute them, and actually create a different kind of real plan that would be, and not the Paris Accord. I mean, everybody knows that this is a kind of a placeholder for something that is not achievable yet, because there isn't a political consensus around the need for decisive action, and because there's so much corporate intervention
Yeah.
in terms of trying to prevent that from happening. And so, I think we really need to be attuned to the ways in which it's very easy for the Green New Deal. I mean, I know you both have said this too, to become the corporate New Deal, more corporate handouts, as a way of really rebranding American manufacturing, and reorganizing American factory production, in order to protect domestic interests, and continue also appropriating the majority of the world's resources, and abandoning everybody else to their fate, while they suck down the poison there that the rich countries produce. So I think, over and over, we have to continue looking through a global South lens at these environmental solutions, so-called solutions, including the one that your critique of the electric cars is right on, and this is something that we're talking about in Puerto Rico very much, around solar power, because part of their recovery plan, there's a lot to say about energy in Puerto Rico in relationship to austerity and disaster recovery, but I'll limit myself right now, just to point out the ways in which the disaster recovery has really been a corporate bonanza for corporations looking to startup companies that have received contracts inexplainably, to take over massive infrastructure, including a company called Luma, who's right now positioned to basically take ownership over not only the entire electrical system in Puerto Rico, but also, and I just found this out, all of the water reservoirs in Puerto Rico. All of the water reservoirs in Puerto Rico would become privately owned by Luma Corporation. And then they would provide the water to the existing water company in Puerto Rico, and of course passing the bill on, the increased bill, on to consumers. So, again, I think we have to continue to insist that the climate conversation is a global conversation, and it cannot be centered on a narrow national interest, at the same time as of course, every national context has its specific dynamics around that. And I'll stop there.
Oh, thank you so much. Does anyone else, we're sort of coming up on time. Does anyone else want to add something there?
I'll just say really fast. I mean, I would include also in the question around environment, the issue around demilitarization as a demand of the left, in these questions around weaponization. Nuclear is still a big issue, but also just in terms of this, the range in terms of bombing, the range in terms of Vieques was a bombing range for a long time, the use of tear gas, all that stuff. I mean, so I think that, if we're talking about having a clean environment, we have to also talk about demilitarizing our society as well.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, that also kind of brings us full circle, right? Because of course, all of the Biden plans are framed in a military ramp up, in a military and economic ramp up, specifically against the sort of now, again, bipartisan consensus, maybe not around things like welfare benefits, but bipartisan consensus around things like a sort of Cold War, or new Cold War, or still called new Cold War, with China. And I think that's very germane, not only as a foreign policy issue, but in fact as part of this sort of holistic climate question and all these other ones. And maybe that's where we should end. And I will say that, like, something that Kaz said before, I think is maybe the point to end on, which is a lot of the ideas that, you know, we talk about in terms of left analysis and left strategy and left proposals actually are quite popular. And I think one of the things that I've encountered in research and looking at stuff is that there's still a gap between, as Kat said, right, polling 60, 70, 80% of people, right, supporting this stuff, and then but not necessarily believing it's possible. Or like, there's some work to be done there too. And I hope this is some small contribution to that. So I think that probably draws us to a close. So I want to thank Kazembe and Rafael and Adriana and Alyssa and all of you for tuning in. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your evening. It's hard to like wish people well in times like these, but you know, I wish you as well as you can be.
Isn't it going to be like a get together with the Institute?
Oh yeah, I was trying not to be too self-promotional. Yeah, if you are in New York City on Saturday, we are hosting an event, an actual in-person. Talk about socializing. We haven't socialized enough. I mean, really socialized. Socials. I always meant that as a pun in the name of the institute, actually. So yes, on Saturday we'll be in Prospect Park. Go to our website and you can sign up. It's suggested donation, but if you can't, that's cool too. But if you can, that's even better. And there will be snacks and some, and it's BYOB, but some drinks provided, and also some music and even karaoke, which
wow,
is
karaoke
allowed in New York for like the first time in like a year and a half or something. I don't know.
Shut it down.
Yeah, maybe I shouldn't have said that on the fucking internet. Now I'm gonna get like a letter from the cops. All right. Well, anyway, have a great night, everyone, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thanks,
All right,
everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Good
That was
night.
great. Awesome.
Have a good night.